Thank you everyone for being here. As I said, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm especially looking forward to this conversation with our guest, Naveeda Khan, who hails from Bangladesh but comes to us from Washington, around Baltimore,
Yes.
at the Johns Hopkins University. And I am delighted that we will be talking and launching her book, which is this wonderful title, आपको बाद में मौका मिले तो देखने का. And in fact, I might even ask you about the title. It's called The Quest for a Shared Planet. And I like the word quest, and maybe we can also talk about her, about why quest and why not sort of the search or something else. If a search would be the same, they can quest obviously suggests that we haven't gotten there yet. But we're going to talk about this book called In Quest of a Shared Planet, Negotiating Climate from the Global South. So it's certainly an issue, it's certainly a question that is very live for many of us in many parts of the world, certainly here in Pakistan, but also all across for the South. It has been sort of this long journey of both hope, sometimes despair, sometimes aspiration, sometimes frustration, and that is what this book is about. I will ask Naveeda to talk more about it, and then we will get into a conversation. Our hope is that we will be able to get you in the conversation much earlier than has been happening, because I think it is important to do that. But एक चीज जो मैं कहना चाहूँगा, it's I enjoyed reading the book, and thank you for the electronic copy that enabled me to do that. It is a subject that I started my own career working and then writing about, but my writings were in the late 90s when we were still more hopeful and starry-eyed about these things around UNFCCC and so on and so forth. But one of the things that Naveeda and I have in common, but I think anyone who works on the Global South in this question has in common, is the late Salimul Haq. A dear friend to me and colleague to Naveeda also, and she mentioned him in the book. And I did want to start by saying I would like, if it, and I know you would too, to dedicate this conversation to Salim, who would have enjoyed this, and we would have enjoyed having him in this, who died rather suddenly. A few months ago, and was a powerhouse, the most mild powerhouse you could imagine, but in really helping frame how developing countries, how the South looks at climate, particularly framing how we look at climate and what is called adaptation, which we will talk about, but most particularly in framing how we think about climate change, not as a, if I can use the Urdu phrase, bhare pet ka chochla, not as something that sort of is a rich people issue, but as something that is very much a poor people context and reality. I had the pleasure of working with him right at the beginning of both his and my career, and then for many years, as did Naveeda. So I wanted to do that. Let me stop there with those two goals. Okay, we want to have a conversation. And we want to bring you into the conversation as soon as or sooner than has been happening, at least in some other places, with those two goals. Lekin, Naveeda, my sense was that maybe a good place to start is to have you help us understand both the book, why this book, how did it happen, why did it happen, and is it a good thing that it happened?
That's a very provocative question. Is it a good thing that it happened? But before that, let me just thank Dr. Yaqub Bangash for inviting me. This was such a lovely opportunity. I used to live and research in Lahore in the late 1990s when I was a doctoral student at Columbia University, and my dissertation was based on Lahore. And I haven't had much opportunity to come back to this lovely city since then. So this ThinkFest is a lovely occasion for me to be here. So thank you to Dr. Bangash and to the organizers of the ThinkFest. And thank you also to Dr. Najam for the kind introduction and the provocative questions as to was this book really necessary? But before that, just a little bit of context about how I came to write the book. I also want to deeply appreciate Dr. Salim ul Haq, who was an incredible mentor for me. He was one of these people who I would go to in the throes of despair, thinking, what is the world doing about climate change? What are we able to do as a small, vulnerable country like Bangladesh? And he just had tremendous reserves of, I wouldn't call it, optimism, right? I would call it just incredible reserves of just thinking very steadily and staying the course on something, right? And so he would say, we may not have made the big win, but we've made a small step. And just, you can't keep getting, frustrated because you haven't reached all that you hope to achieve. And so, I decided to actually follow him into the process to understand how that looks like from within the UN-led global negotiation process. And so I started to effectively shadow him from 2015 at what is called the COPs, the Conference of Parties that are held by the United Nations. And so I first went to COP 21, which was in Paris, and which, for those of you who've heard of the Paris Agreement, will know is the COP at which that particular piece of law was written into presence, right? So when I was there with him, trying to understand, how it is that 190 plus countries were coming together to write what was essentially universal law that was going to be applicable to every country. And the fact that then I would have to go to 7 more COPs to see that agreement be discussed. So again, you can see where my frustration would lie. I would have thought that 2015, when the law was first sort of drafted, that was the beginning of meaningful climate change. And yet that law kept having to be negotiated and spelled out, and the rules of its implementation spelled out for subsequent another 5 COPs. And so, following him through that process, seeing how he keeps up his spirit and his activities in terms of bringing developing countries together in staying the course, was the inspiration for the book, was to try and understand why it is that small countries who realize that this process will not deliver meaningful climate action in the short time frame that we have, what is it that keeps them coming? And they weren't just coming for cynical reasons. I followed the Bangladeshi negotiators, who I talk about in the book, and it's very clear they're not just in there to get development aid. Countries like the US, European Union, India were doing what they needed to do to make their economies more carbon efficient, to mitigate, so that countries like Bangladesh, countries like in the Pacific Islands, had a fighting chance of not being devastated by.
Sorry to cut in. Lekin, ye COP mein, a lot of us have this inside
Yes.
Talk, and we get excited. Just for those of our colleagues who may not
Yes.
know the COP, you want to give a 101 on कि ये COP है क्या बला? सुना हर एक ने, because we know वो आती है and we see it in the news, there is COP.
So essentially the COP is a meeting of the sovereign nations of the world coming together once a year to negotiate universal policy on global climate change. What every country is now bound to do as according to that agreement that they sign. And so every year the COP is held, the Conference of Parties meaning the countries that have signed onto the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so every year they come, and the Paris Agreement comes out of one of those meetings. And that particular meeting was held in 2015. Is that, yes, okay, all right. So yes, okay, sorry. So just to get back to very quickly, and I'll keep it brief. So essentially, I got interested in trying to understand why countries like Bangladesh, why countries like Pakistan, even engaged in this process. They didn't create this problem. They hardly have the kind of economy that's going to mitigate to make a meaningful difference in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Why come? Why follow the negotiations so intensely? And why actually, essentially, have stakes in this process? Why not just say it's a problem of developed countries, let them deal with it, right? And trying to understand that meant that I had to talk to the negotiators. I had to talk to not just the Bangladeshi negotiators, but also the negotiators of all the small blocks that represented developing countries. So, for example, African groups of negotiators, negotiators from Pacific island nations that were, under the title of AOSIS. LDCs, least developed countries, which have many African countries, but also countries from South Asia, and so on. So following the negotiators gave me a set of perspectives on what it is that the countries hope to get from the negotiation. But I also followed civil society and activists who were coming to the process and to see what they were doing. Why were they coming? They knew, again, that this process was not going to deliver anything meaningful in terms of their own country. Why were they coming so diligently? And I realized they came to keep their countries in line, to make sure that countries were aware that their own citizens were keeping an eye on them, that they couldn't just, as sovereign nations, represent countries without some recognition that there wasn't difference amongst their citizenry, that the citizenry didn't feel that they were being properly represented by their countries. Particularly indigenous nations, they feel that the sovereign nations under which they live have not given them a fair hand. So it's very important for the various indigenous communities to come and to remind that, they're keeping an eye on their nations. So studying activists, studying indigenous groups, studying negotiators, studying experts. There were many, many experts in this process, as you can imagine, and experts who were working on behalf of vested interests, but also experts who are extremely, extremely noble. So studying the whole range of them, what I realized is, even though this process wasn't going to deliver on meaningful climate action, it was really the only international process we had. Right? And so even while we ratcheted up all our actions that we need to take at the country level, at local level, community level, that we also had to keep investing and keeping an eye on and prodding what was going on in this central space, right? And then the other thing that I realized is, because of entirely procedural reasons, every single country's voice counted. Every country had a vote. And so consequently, this was a place in which Bangladesh was given as much importance as, say, UK within the negotiations. And so that also gave developing countries a certain kind of confidence to be able to partake in these conversations and not feel that they were always going to be marginalized. And they have the numbers, exactly. G77 and China, which represents over 128 countries of the world. And so, if every country has a vote, and a vote that counts equally as every other country's, then obviously this is a significant playing space in terms of making claims. I'm not sure that always, it delivers on things that they're being claimed, but...
So there is a logic, as you laid out, in why developing countries go to this. Do they get what they want?
Well, it depends on what it is that they're asking for at the time. So the issue that I followed, and I followed pretty much from the start of it till its conclusion in COP28, was loss and damage, right? So I saw how loss and damage came up in conversations outside of the space of the negotiations. Then I saw how it first became a mechanism, had some sort of legal status. Then it became a pillar within the climate, within the Paris Agreement. And then, you saw the fight slowly and surely as coalitions built up to pushing for a loss and damage fund that was actually inaugurated at COP28. So at least it isn't as though that loss and damage fund being there is so promising, right? But it's conceptually the acknowledgement that there is such a thing as loss and damage that I think is very important, right?
And I think for our audience and ourselves, this is an important point. That, if you're doing international affairs in general, but certainly multilateral negotiation, you have to enjoy watching paint dry on a wall, because it is a slow, tedious, painful process that needs the patience of Salim al-Haq.
Yes.
Right? Because we often say, okay, the flood has come, so why haven't they done it?
Yes.
But that's not how it works.
No. No, and the important thing here is that, we might think that procedure is so apolitical, right? Because, I mean, if you're following the recent conversations in the International Court of Justice, procedure is being used by Canada, by South Africa, not South Africa, by Israel against South Africa to undermine South Africa's position. And you might think this is exactly what is so frustrating about an international process, that procedure could actually stop a proper conversation on what's going on. However, in a situation like the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and these negotiations that happen every year, it's the fact that it is procedural, that people don't bring in, all the hundreds of years of colonialism, of extractivism, of neo-colonialism, etc. The fact that developing countries themselves are vested in making sure that the language stays procedural and not get politicized, that ensures that something happens, as you say, a little bit of the drying of the paint from one year to the next. But the fact is that once it's written, then something is going to happen as an aftermath of it, right? So, sorry.
And I guess, again, for our audience especially, one should respect, frustrating as it is, that procedure has reason, right? There is the difference between and the is actually not insignificant. That you will spend the entire night figuring out this one sentence which has the word a mechanism versus the mechanism is going to make a lot of difference for a lot of people. And it's not just because they're lawyers or they'll put brackets. Brackets is the UN negotiation system of saying this is not yet complete, so we need to work on this sentence. But any insights of that sort of nature? Have you, or maybe let me make it a question. Have you come out of this process of the book and all this that you've seen respecting the system, or saying, let the pox be on your house?
So first, the question of why did you write this book, and have you come out respecting the system? So what I have come out respecting is people's investment in it, right? Because I'm an anthropologist, it means that, I have to go someplace and I have to spend a long time trying to understand how something works, or why people do the kinds of things they do, or how they give explanations for the reasons for what they do. It means that I cannot dismiss this, right? Because I studied the process and I studied people and they invest in it, so out of respect for them, I have to also respect the process, right? So that's the extent of what I'm willing to say in terms of whether I respect the process or not. I respect the people in it, and I respect their investment in it. I myself, and people will say this who are also part of the process, don't have faith in it, in the sense that I don't have faith that it will produce results, meaningful results, at least not in the time frame that we need results. For instance, if we are going to keep temperature levels under 1.5, there's nothing in this process that's going to keep it under 1.5. In fact, most of the conversations now say we are going to overshoot it, and now let's hope that we can bring it back to 1.5. So that means already there's acknowledgement that we're going to breach 1.5. And so, we're not going to get actions in that way. But on the other hand, we are such a crude geopolitical system, right, in terms of the world, a world of nations invested in their own sovereignty and in their own security, that this may be the only way in which countries come into some kind of sync in terms of this issue. Right? Because everywhere else competition reigns, or direct aggression reigns. So in this space, at least, there is some kind of agreement that we live in the same world together, and that we have equal rights over its resources, right? Yeah. So
I would smiling because sort of one of the many reasons I was very glad to be able to have this opportunity is my own dissertation was somewhat similar. This is way back, 1997, MIT, and it was called Beyond the Lowest Common Denominator, and my question was similar to yours, which was, when developing countries know they won't get anything out of the system, why do they keep making alliances with each other, right? Which is not why do they participate, but the G77 is what I was studying. When you're a weak player and you know you won't win, why do you even fight? And why do you come into coalitions and alliances to fight? So when I saw this, I thought, oh, wow, this is very much, that was a primitive question. Yours is much more. My answer was because if you are a weak player in general, and I was again dealing with environmental negotiations in general, this was 97, you play and you make alliances not because you want to win, but because you want to ensure that you do not lose. What brings you to the fight is not that you might win. What brings you to the fight is if you aren't there, you might even lose more by your absence, right? That's why people make unions. Labor comes into alliances, or the G77 comes up. So I say all of that by way of asking, so in some ways, if I were to say, what's the big lesson that you learned from this? The reason I asked, worth doing or not, would you do it again? If you had to see this paint drying on the wall, is it worth it? But what would be the big lesson that you think you personally learned in doing this that you might not have guessed at the beginning?
What I learned is that, I'm not sure that it was such a huge learning. It was an appreciation of something. Exactly the kind of thing that you also have realized through your own scholarly work and your own experience, work experience, and so on, which is that if we aren't there, then we stand to lose more. Right? And so, all the climate justice activists, what they point to may seem very insignificant in terms of practical gains, but they're so pleased that the language justice has now entered into the discourse. If they hadn't been going, and if they hadn't been saying that, we can't just think about climate in terms of carbon emissions and reducing carbon emissions and efficiencies, if we just focus on that, then there are people who are going to suffer simply because you've put effective climate policies in place. People who are going to be displaced because of wind farms, people who are going to be dispossessed of lands, and so on. So climate policy could be as violent as the very policies that created climate change as a problem in the first place. So just by going and by shouting in crowds outside, saying we demand climate justice, that language has trickled into the conversations. And so this year was the first year where, last year actually in Egypt was the first year that something like this phrase of just transition even became codified into the text. This language has been around, but just by sheer repetition, finally it starts to shift discourse. And so if the activists hadn't been going, if the trade unionists hadn't been going, if the civil society activists hadn't been going, then maybe that conversation would have never come about. It would have been entirely about market approaches to making our economies more efficient.
And I do think this is an important point, particularly I think today, this phrase that did not exist, climate anxiety. There is a generation for whom this is going to be a reality of their lives as opposed to a goal for the future. And the anxiety is real, but in some ways, my generation may not have done a good job of saying why we were doing this, because we might have added to the anxiety. I sometimes worry because it's kind of like protesters. When you're standing with that placard, someone can easily say, will it make a difference? And probably the answer is no, not right now. But what would make a difference is if you're not doing it, right, as you point out. And with climate, there's actually interesting, I have other problems with the book, a rather interesting book that's just come out, which points out makes the case for climate optimism. That part I don't buy, but what I think she's saying is that if we had done nothing, we would be talking about 4.5 degrees. So simply the fact that we're talking 1.5 or 2, bad as it is, let us at least celebrate where we might have been in the alternative. Any thoughts on that optimism or not? But then, before I open, I have to ask you, what were you doing in Lahore? Meaning, tell us about your research. As a Lahori, I need to know, what did you find out about these lovely people that they should know?
Okay, I will. So, again, as an anthropologist, I don't usually like to talk at the level of like countries. Here I am talking about Bangladesh or Pakistan or G77 and China. I really am much more interested in very specific practices. You can imagine as an anthropologist, interested in rituals and so on, right? So, one of the things that I would do is, of course, spend a lot of time with the groups of people I was working with. And one of the groups, as I mentioned already, were activists. So, I mean, I had to show up early in the morning. I had to stand there with signs and shout and scream. And, it wasn't as though I wasn't being cynical, but nor was I a true believer, right? I was a participant. I was a participant observer. What I realized was these youth from all around the world, they would shriek and scream and, make such a tamasha in front of the conference spaces, right? And shouting at the negotiators, etc. And afterward, you could feel that they felt a collective calm. Right? I would spend time afterward just going to have a cup of tea, etc. They would congratulate each other, they would hug each other, etc. And it was such a small thing, but you felt that it was not just that it was cathartic, that they got their anxiety out or whatever, but that it actually produced lines of solidarity amongst themselves. And so that was what happened to me, is that in the initial part, I would stand around the margins and I would write notes on what they're doing, right? And after a point, I realized that I needed to immerse myself in that activity to actually understand why they even invested in it, because it seemed so puny compared to the enormity of the problem, right? 100 activists saying, I demand climate justice, 45,000 participants, and who's listening, right? And so once I joined up with them, I started to realize that this actually produces a very important level of solidarity that endures after this event, right? WhatsApp groups and strategizing and getting ready for the next one, etc. And this happens among the officials, this happens amongst the bureaucrats, this happens amongst the secretariat officials and so on. And so that was an insight that was interesting, that there was actual lines of solidarity that were being created that were kind of unusual, not just the ones across activists, but across negotiators and activists, such that the negotiator couldn't ignore an activist, because they go every year. They've seen each other. They've been in conversation over years.
And again, sorry to cut in, but there's also this very sort of mischievous confluence between the negotiator and the protester. I, as negotiator, may not like the protest that is against me, but I can now take it with me to that room when I'm negotiating with another country and say, didn't you see those young people outside? Didn't you hear what Greta is saying? But anyhow.
Oh yes, about Lahore.
Yes, what does Naveeda know about Lahore that Lahore needs to know?
Yes, so I spent about 2 years here. I learned Urdu and I did research. And interestingly, my research was on something completely different than this book. It was really on mosque construction. It was on the politics of mosque construction. And it was in the late 1990s. So it was really, during a time of sectarianism and quite a lot of sectarian violence. So my question was, again, not so different from what I'm asking now, which is when people know that mosques are going to be sites of conflict, of qabza, etc., why is it that they still throw themselves in to building not just this one got qabza-fied, they'd go to and build another one. It isn't just a directive or a responsibility as a Muslim to build a mosque, but there was something else at work. And so I spent a lot of time in different neighborhoods and looking at specific mosques and also reading the Constituent Assembly debates and Iqbal, etc., etc. And I wrote a book called Muslim Becoming, Aspiration and Skepticism in Pakistan, and which is really talking about how it is that in order to understand Pakistan, one mustn't think of it as having an unrealized or an incomplete understanding of its own identity, but to think of how it actually committed to experimentation as a way of life, right? So that's why Muslim becoming, as opposed to something that is already achieved. So.
Excellent, excellent. I have 1,000 questions, but I will hold them. If you're okay,
Yes,
should
absolutely.
we ask our audience if any thoughts on climate, COPs, mosques, and becoming? Anyone? That's unusual. I can threaten you. If you don't, I will.
Yes.
Yes, we have a question here from this gentleman.
I was just wondering, in COP, we have lost and damaged fund, and Pakistan is one of the biggest loser. Last year, we had around $32 billion loss in floods. So will we be able to get something out of this climate justice?
So that's an excellent question. I mean, if you had gone to Dr. Najam's talk earlier in the day, you would know that, one of the things that came out of an earlier COP was a kind of commitment by the developed countries to give something like 100 billion to ensure that that would be the baseline of the monies that developed countries would give in order to help with countries making transitions in their economies, etc. And that money was promised in 2015, was supposed to materialize by 2021, and has yet to show up, right? So essentially, this process is a graveyard of many such processes or promises. There are many, many small funds, least developed countries fund, green climate fund, and so on. So funds have been established, but there aren't people putting in money into the coffers of these funds, right? So the expectation is, unfortunately, that the loss and damage fund will be one more fund which will be looking for developed countries to put money into them as and when they wish, because it's entirely dependent on voluntary donations. And so I think that this process is not one which will help with the redistribution that has been the promise of international processes for a long time, right? However, I feel that it provides a template in the sense that now with a loss and damage fund, there's going to be a discussion on how the countries are going to make sure that their losses are registered, right? How are they going to provide, claims against those losses? So procedures will develop, right? Which will mean if in the future, we are seeing a situation in which there are many more losses and damages, developed countries can't just say, oh, these things can't be accounted for. How do you account for loss and damage, right? There will be a process that will tell you how that's done.
Can I move that forward, and if you allow me a
please.
proposition and for you to react on? Some of these funds have been called by me and others to be placebo funds. They give zero money, and they're like sort of, you set up a placebo fund and now everyone is happy something is done, but there isn't. But maybe I'm being cynical. This issue of finance, and I want to link it to you as an anthropologist, and we were talking earlier, your work with communities and on riverbeds, right? What do these things mean for that? And here is my provocation. Climate finance, for example, has this idea, and the big numbers they throw has brought in a rather nasty set of crowd which thinks there is money in this game. And there are countries, there are companies, there are professors, there are all sorts of folks, because we throw big numbers, 100 billion,
more,
and so on and so forth. So there's this sense that somehow there's money, and what can I do to get hold of some of this money? Whereas the reality, it seems to me, is that the whole problem is there isn't money. The reason we are using the big numbers is to say what the need is, not as if there's a pot waiting somewhere. I've said a long thing, but here's the provocation. If I think of the flood that was mentioned by my colleague who went to the same university as me, UET at one point, the World Bank said the loss and damage was 32 billion. Right? Now, even if there's a fund, none of that has come to the farmer whose home was destroyed. If it's going to come, it's going to come to some government department or some company or some consultant or for me for a report or whatever. But more importantly, here is the math as I see it. So the World Bank at that point said the loss and damage is 32 billion. Pakistan makes a big sort of hue and cry, lote gaye, mare gaye, how bad, you are bad, we are nice, you must help us, this, that, and the other. The world says, yes, very sorry. They hold a conference, they say, we will commit to 9 billion. So here's the math, 32 billion, 9 billion. Of the 9 billion, the only amount that has actually come in is 780 million. Let's say it's a billion. My question is, if a billion has come in and the loss to the farmers and stuff, because that's what they counted, was 32 billion, who paid the other 31 billion? Because it seems to me real climate finance is happening by the poorest people in the world, because there was a farmer who had a home, the home was destroyed, and all that he could do was to sell the savings that he was making for, let's say, his daughter's wedding, and now he has had to rebuild. That's climate finance. Right? We know, for example, that the daughter's wedding he was waiting for, the daughter got married off at 14 because for that parent, not that he's a bad parent, maybe not 14, maybe 16, that is a security measure that I can get her away from the floodplain. So the longest thing, the question here for you both as an anthropologist, but given your work, do these things mean anything to the real people who will now have to face the consequences? And by that, I don't mean just the rich countries. Do we, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, are we making those connections for any of this to trickle down to the life of this farmer, his daughter, his cattle?
So my second research project after I was done with working on mosques in Pakistan has been to work on a very large river in Bangladesh called Jamuna, which actually, is this working still? I don't know. Yeah, okay. Which is the Brahmaputra in India, but then becomes the Jamuna, renames itself Jamuna when it comes into Bangladesh. Looking at the people who live on sandbanks or shores in the middle of the river, and one of the questions I had was, how do they live with moving land? How is it possible for there to be things like land ownership or titles to property when if the river keeps breaking your land, right? And one of the amazing things that I discovered, and this goes back to your point about the incredible resilience or adaptability of humans, right, is that these were people who were living in incredibly precarious, very poor, and in an incredibly physically dynamical environment, right? And they had yet evolved a market for land. Right? And the way they did that was once it was up and they had it settled and they had it titled, right? Once it was broken, you still had the title. You could sell the title. There was a market for titles of land that was not broken, but under the river. Right? Yes. So this was such an incredible insight to me about how it is that people live in the speculative mode, right? And in effect, these were poor people who can't think 50 years or 100 years. They maybe cannot even think up to a year, right? But they, at any one time, has about 10 other possibilities built into it, right? If the flood comes, then the seeds from here will go there, and I will have an orchard at the end of the year. If the floods don't come and my land breaks, I'll scoop up the seeds and I'll take them to my next place, right? And so on and so forth. So when studying that made me realize that, I mean, it's incredible that we pass on all the losses to ordinary people, but there is incredible resilience and incredible imaginative work that's going on, which isn't just about surviving, but it's also about trying to eke out something like safety nets, etc., where the state fails at it, right?
If we test their resilience again and again
No,
and
no,
again,
yes,
right?
yes. That's the fear, is that it isn't constant plasticity, that at some point you reach the limits of adaptation, right? So one of the reasons why I even went to Paris in the first place is because I wanted to see if people like this kind of thinking, this kind of living, ever found reflection there at that level, at the level of the UN. And obviously, there's an incredible lack of connection. There's a complete disjuncture between, the communities I work with and Bangladesh, even the government, even the development workers who show up at these places. They're not able to do that. But one thing I did notice, and this is not necessarily for the good, one thing that always travels towards the islands, right, towards the communities I'm working on, are always schemes like insurance schemes. Like they seem to show up, they don't need that much time, that the insurance is being sold to them or attempted to be sold to them all the time. And that's what makes me worried. Like I see a lack of fit between what these people are doing and what's happening at the international.
Say more. I mean, I have this thing, sort of this snake oil insurance sellers, right? Pay me
Yes.
the dividend now, and when your flood will come. And I understand the logic. I don't mean to undermine it. Because
I
see
undermine
the
it.
logic,
I'm
but
terrified of
partly
it. Yes.
it makes me a little creepy feeling.
Yeah, no, for instance, okay, so the islands I'm talking about are islands that accrete. So they have a certain conical formation, right? Floods, when they come, they go over flat land. And if you're going to experience flood, what flood is basically is water boundedness, right? So if you have a territory where the water goes over your territory, then you haven't technically, according to insurance schemes, experienced a flood, even though everything of yours was washed away, right? Because their definition of a flood is when the water is there on your territory for a certain number of days, right? And so through these sorts of mechanisms, you can be sold flood insurance and then you can lose out anyway.
And this I'll underscore for our audience, and please, if other questions, raise your hand, what you had said earlier, that things can, and I would think will happen more and more in the name of climate change. That may neither be good for climate nor especially for the poorest people, right? This again, sort of, because it has become such a big issue, because there is this presumption of resources here, you will necessarily attract all sorts of actors with all sorts of motivations. But I was absolutely loved your story about you can sell land that is under the water and that there's a market for it. I don't know if you know this, but I'm assuming others here might. There's a famous, probably the greatest living poet for my money in Urdu, the greatest living poet in Urdu is Iftikhara. No, sorry, this is not Iftikhara. This is Noon Mim Rashid. He has a poem called Andha Kabadi. Kabadi is someone who sells used goods. Andha is blind. But the reason it's a beautiful poem, I won't go into the poem, just the name tells you. It is this guy who's blind, and he's selling used dreams, right? So he's a seller of dreams, and the dreams are used, and no one wants his dreams. So somehow that thing,
That image flashed to your
that
mind.
flashed in my mind.
Got it.
Any questions here? And then there. Did someone have a mic? Aap karna bol.
Yeah.
Or grab mic.
We are seeing a lot of answers coming up from Pakistan that we were not familiar with just because of the poor air quality here, having more issues with lung cancers and all that. So my question is that you have worked in Lahore in the 1990s and you're coming back in the 2020s. So what difference have you seen in the environment in Lahore, and what message can you give to the common man, how they can help in improving the situation for the future? And what is the role of a common man in preventing some of the issues that we are facing in Lahore in terms of pollution and environmental stress that we are seeing?
Hi. My question is, do you think that there is, or at least in the COP, the developing countries think that there is still a technical fix to climate change? And if there is, does it create a problem of moral hazard? And if there is no technical solution and we need a human solution, then what about the elephant in the room, which is capitalism? And related question is, are there any anthropologists who are on the UNFCCC expert panel?
The change that I've seen in Lahore since I was here, I mean, when I was here, it was already a little bit smoggy, not to the degree that it is now. It is quite intense. But again, I don't know. I was speaking at the University of Punjab yesterday, and one of the questions I was asked is, what paradigms have changed in terms of the studying the world? And what I was saying is that we really need to stop just studying political economies and our elites and their political parties and their election patterns, etc. We need to understand that something like the environment is also a historical product, right? We look at it and we just think it's nature, or it is just at this point the industry or the burning of woods. But nothing is that quick. There isn't such a one-to-one correspondence between an activity and its effect that, the way that it gets intensified or the way that it has a certain seasonality, etc. All of these things are the result of political processes, of historical events, of people's actions, etc. And so we have to learn to look at the world around us with a different set of eyes, right? We have to understand them in the same way that we might understand a building going up and knowing that it's the corrupt politician who's building that building as a safe haven for his money, right? We have to look at the environment with that kind of knowledge and understanding, right? So given that, I find that it's actually hard to put the onus on ordinary people. Because again, the community that I was working on, I mean, I find it hard to expect they're resilient, they're creative, they're speculative, etc. But I find it hard to look to them and say, what solutions do you have for us, Bangladeshis, for climate change? Which people will do. They will say, Bangladeshis at the cutting edge of climate change, look to them to get lessons, right? I find that to be a problematic proposition, because the change, if it has to come, it has to be at a more structural level. It has to be through national will and action, right? Or a more collective community action and so on. It doesn't just necessarily need to be top down. So my question would be more about how is it that we can facilitate people's organizing so that they can look at the environment through political eyes, right? As opposed to what can one person do, or how can we change our behavior, right? So that would be my, I don't know, inefficient, but inchoate response to that. In terms of the elephant in the room, I mean, one of the things about the UNFCCC process is that I think it's not unfair to say that it's an entirely captured process. It is one which comes out of the desire to keep market economies, out of a commitment to market economies to ensure that economies stay competitive at the same time as they are trying to tackle the issue of climate change through the category of sustainability, right? So this is not a process where you get alternative visions of what the world economy can be, right? And even the activists who come to it, even if they're quite radical, they're degrowth, you've got anarchists, and you've got some, radical Marxists. Even when they come to this process, they don't have that expectation, because there's such a de-link. That language doesn't quite translate into such a market-oriented process, which is also always thinking of itself as sending a signal to the market, right? And that's why all the big promises of money, it's not like they're actually committing to money, right? They're committing to the raising of the money, and so a solicitation to companies to be a part of the process of raising of the money, right? Through different means. So I don't know if this is the process which is going to deliver on an alternative vision. Thank you. And so I think that this new thing that I was talking about, this conversation on just transition, it may fail in this space, it may go nowhere, but it's the one little crack that I've found through which people are finally saying, how do we talk about workers? What about workers who are going to have to, deal with the closing of coal mines, etc.? And so the way in which indigenous groups, women, youth have latched on to what is essentially a workers' platform, right, is quite interesting. So there are all sorts of congresses happening in different parts of the world now to say, how do we flesh out? Can this be a space to think about alternatives, right? So let's see. I don't know. Time will tell.
Thank you, thank you. Time flies when you're having fun. And we're having fun, and we're told that. I think that message was for me. But before we end, one question, and maybe a big question, and I'll throw in my own thoughts on that maybe, but having seen what you've seen, having done what you've done, having written what you've written, if you had a magic wand and you could do anything to the future of the cops, what would you do? The cops.
Of the cops. If I could change it
If
in
you could
some
change,
way,
you could
either a little
strengthen, you
tweak
could
or a
remove,
passive
yeah.
thing, yes. What I would love is some honesty, right? In the sense that there's diplomacy, and diplomacy is a game, and you have to.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But no, please.
But all I want is a tiny acknowledgement that industrialization, they've accepted. Industrialization has created or accentuated the great acceleration of climate change. But some acknowledgement that industrialization went hand in hand with colonialism, right? If they don't, history books have been written about it. Countries don't disavow it in their own country context. But that language of colonialism does not enter into this process at all. And it really hurts me because, not because, I come from a country that experienced 200 years of British colonialism, but because it seems unhistorical. Right? It seems, that's what I mean by honesty. I don't mean like we're going to now reveal all the awful things Exxon is doing, et cetera, or Coca-Cola's in there and what, it's doing in terms of the water and depriving countries in the Latin Americas of their water, et cetera. But if they could just be a little bit more acknowledgement that industrialization came off the backs of slavery and colonialism, and maybe not even in those inflammatory ways, in much more neutral, climate diplomatic ways, some more historical insight, then I would have faith that something like a real assessment of the issue could happen. Right now we're not yet assessing or diagnosing the problem fully.
Thank you. I wish you the best in that wish. I thank you for a wonderful conversation and great candor. I thank you all for being here. We will continue this conversation elsewhere.
Excuse me?
Thank you everyone for being here.
Excuse me, one question.
We'll continue it afterwards. Thank you.